Hey everyone, welcome. This video, we're going to start the conversation on forms. When it comes to forms, we probably use one every single time we use the internet. Whether we're logging into our social media, checking out LinkedIn, going to Blackboard, any of those things that we do requires a login form. Now, forms have two components that make them work. First is the form that we see on the web page. That form contains all of the fields, the buttons, drop-down menus, everything needed to collect information from a user. And second, once that form has been completed and submitted, something has to happen. So the user submits the form and all of the entered data goes to a server. And the server in the application that runs on it then processes the information. Now for this course, we're focusing on the first part where we're just collecting and filling out all of that information in order to send it to a server. So go out to Blackboard and download that Week 10 Demo Forms folder and open that up in VS Code. I'll do the same. I'm going to open my preview right away, but I'm also going to need my live server today. Let's focus right away where it says start your form here. Now everything that goes into our form has to go between the opening form tag and that closing form tag. And there's three attributes that I want to cover immediately. The first one is the name attribute. This simply gives our form a name. This is going to come in very helpful and handy, especially once we start working with JavaScript. Now the value that we put inside of that attribute is up to us, but it should be meaningful, shouldn't have any spaces, and if you're going to have more than one word, we should use camel casing. I chose where the name is equal to pizza form because if our website ends up having more than one form on it, it's helpful to know which form we're filling out. That's the first attribute. The second attribute is the action attribute. Now this attribute tells the form where it needs to go. Once that user clicks submit, it needs to go to an address or a URL or to that application that's going to process the entered data. For our class, we'll always use the same one. It's an address to a server located right on campus. Now our last one, the last attribute, is the method attribute, and this tells the browser how the data is going to end up going to the server. For our course, we'll always use the attribute value of post. And I'll describe the difference between post and get in a little bit. With that out of the way, we can now focus on some of our form fields and our input types, because there's a lot of different types of data that can get entered into a form. It can be plain text or passwords or emails or addresses, dates, all of those different things. And the input element is what we use to create entry fields for input. An input is an empty element, meaning it contains no content of its own. But the input uses several different attributes, and we'll cover those a little bit later. One of our attributes is the type attribute. This one's the most important one because it tells the browser what type of data we're expecting the user to enter into this field. We'll start off with just a couple where the type is equal to text. And you'll notice immediately that our preview already has a couple of inputs. In fact, I can go up into those inputs and type anything that I want. Let's create another input that's designed for passwords. This time we'll use the input where the type is equal to password. Now when I type into this box, watch what happens. Let's give ourselves a little more room. The next one that I want to cover isn't an input, it's a text area. Now these are really awesome when we want to have enough space for our users to enter a lot of text. Now with this one, it has both an opening and a closing tag. So far our form has a really nice collection of input boxes, but it really doesn't look much like a proper form yet. And you can see that each text field is displaying on the same line. So that tells us that we're working with inline elements. Let's break them down to their own line by adding a couple of break elements after each of the inputs and text area to force them to a new line. It's looking a little bit better, but our users don't know what it is that we're supposed to be entering into these fields. To accomplish some sort of description, we use labels. We do that with the label element, and we'll put one above each of our inputs and our text area. We'll do labels for first name, last name, and password. And our text area, we'll put down instructions. Alright, the form's looking better, and we can see all of our labels, and they're lining up in line with our inputs, which tells us that labels are also an inline element. Now let's associate the label with the field so that we can click on both the input box and the label to have the cursor automatically appear in our associated field. We do this by associating a label with its input with two attributes, the ID attribute and the for attribute. and the foreign ID attributes have to contain the same value. So for example, this first name input, we're going to put the ID equal to first name, and then we're going to put the labels for attribute to first name. And on my form, I can click on the input boxes, and for the first name, because I've connected those two together, I can click on the label. Now I can also accomplish that same behavior by making the label element a parent of the input. For example, on last name, I'll move it inside of the label. Now I don't have a foreign ID attribute on there, but if I select last name label in my preview, notice that it highlights my input box. It does eliminate the need for using a foreign ID attribute, but I do want to caution that it's still always better to include your foreign ID attributes, always. I like to do both, and I'll show you later on when we're styling forms how that comes into play and why that's a great option. Let me speed this up for you. I'm going to scroll this up for some more room. Alright, our next thing that we want to try and figure out is a way for us to actually push our form or let our users submit their form once they've completed it. We can create another input type and set it to submit. We can also change the name that appears on the submit button by using the value attribute. So now when a user clicks on submit, the form's going to grab the information from the input fields and send it to the location that we indicated in our action attribute, which is that ITINS3 server located on campus. We have an echo.php application that runs on our server. This application takes all of the data that's entered into the form and then just dumps it back out onto an echo page. So let's give this a shot. To do this though, I need to test it in my live server. And I realize now that I have an error in my code, because I mistyped the URL for my action attribute. I missed the echo page. So I've closed out my live server and relaunched. Let's try this again. Now when I select order pizza, I get the green screen. There's a reason why we didn't get any information. So this green screen is what tells us that we've successfully been able to connect to the ITINS server. However, we have some attributes that we need to finish using in order to get a value back from the server. We're going to cover that in another video, but we still have to fix a few more things. One, we need to have a reset button. That's another input element that we'll cover. And the last thing is, we still need to go over the difference between our post and get methods. Let's do that before we start making our form really shine. I'm going to add the input where the type is equal to reset. And I'll set my value to start over. This is really helpful when we're filling out forms and we need to clear out what we've entered in. One click of the button and they all go away. Now the last thing is that post and get, and that refers to the method attribute. This attribute is telling the data how it needs to go to the server. If we're using a post, we're using secured information. Our browser is sending stuff over encrypted. This is best for sending anything that we want to have secured. If we're using the get method, then the encoded information is just added to the end of our URL, so you can see all of the information. Imagine if you had password typed in to the password field. Not very secure. With the post, everything gets sent separate, it's encrypted, so it's a lot more secure. And post is the most common method that's used when setting your method attribute. For our course, we are always going to use the post method. I'm going to end our video here because I want to focus on attributes in the next video. The attributes that we need to make our form work and attributes that we can use that enhance all of our forms and our inputs. Now, if you have any questions on this first portion of forms, please don't hesitate to ask.